He was a man haunted by the family he couldn't save in a blizzard years ago. His lonely cabin was not a home, but a tomb for his memories, a fortress against a world that had taken everything from him. So when a giant horse and its dying foals appeared at his door in another storm, knocking with the desperation of death itself, he didn't just see animals. He saw a second chance. He saw the ghosts of his past asking for a different ending. Narrator. The wind howled like a living thing, a predator made of ice and fury, tearing across the open prairie with a force that rattled the bones of the land itself. Snow whipped sideways, stinging against anything it touched, each flake a shard of glass driven by a gale that had raged for 2 days without pause. The sky was swallowed whole by white. The horizon, the mountains, the very concept of direction, all were gone. The world had been reduced to a swirling, chaotic void. It was not just a storm. It was a beast, roaring and relentless, clawing at the earth as if intent on devouring all that dared to endure. In the middle of that white wilderness sat a ranch that had long been abandoned by anyone with sense. Its roof sagged under the weight of countless winters. The wooden walls were split, with seams wide enough to let the wind slip its cold, probing fingers through. Inside, a fire burned weakly in a stone hearth, its flame flickering low, its smoke curling reluctantly up the chimney. Shadows trembled along the walls, long and skeletal, as if the house itself shivered with each new assault from the storm. Oren sat hunched near the flames, the collar of his worn sheepskin coat pulled up tight. He looked like the storm had carved him out of the very wood. He leaned against hard lines, weathered eyes, a silence that seemed older than his 40 years. He flexed his hands, cracked and raw from a lifetime of hard labor, holding them close enough to the fire that the heat stung before it soothed. He muttered under his breath, a ritual of defiance against the storm's roar. This will pass. It always does. But there was no conviction in the words, only the hollow echo of a habit. This crumbling ranch was not just a place he had found. It was his inheritance, his prison, his penance. 10 years ago, this house had been filled with warmth, with the scent of baking bread, with the soft humming of his wife, Elara. And it had been filled with the promise of a new life, a small cradle he had carved with his own hands waiting by the fire. Then a blizzard, much like this one, had descended. Elara had gone into labor, too soon, too fast. He had tried to ride for the doctor in town, a fool's errand against a wall of white. He had failed. By the time he had fought his way back, the house was silent. He had lost them both, his wife and his newborn son, to the same cold that now clawed at his walls. He had buried them on the hill behind the house, and with them, he had buried the man he used to be. The ranch became a tomb, and he, its solitary groundskeeper. The storm pressed in harder. Snow rattled against the patched windows. A draft snaked in and puffed a small pile of ashes into the room. Oren leaned forward, nudging the logs with an iron poker, watching the embers glow. Then it came. A sound. At first, he thought it was the storm. A log shifting on the woodpile outside, the wind pounding against the door in some strange new rhythm. But no, the sound was off. It was a slow, deliberate, heavy thump that reverberated faintly through the floorboards. He stiffened in his chair, head tilted, listening. Another thump followed, closer this time. It was the cadence of hooves. Labored, dragging, each strike carrying the weight of an impossible exhaustion. No horse should have been out in this. No horse could survive it. Then came a different sound, a cry faint and broken, a whinny stretched thin until it was nearly a wail. The wind tore it apart, but he heard it all the same. It was the sound of a parent's desperation. His stomach tightened. The memory of his own desperate ride 10 years ago, the frantic, useless struggle against the storm, rose in him like bile. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Not my fight, he told himself. Not anymore. The world outside could take what it wanted. It had already taken everything that mattered from him. The hoofbeats faltered, stumbled, then rose again, louder, right outside his door. A final, earth-shaking thud crashed against the door with a force that rattled the entire frame. Wood shuddered. Nails groaned. Oren flinched back, snatching his rifle from its place by the hearth, his breath caught in his throat. The door gave way under his hand, a crack of light splitting the storm. The gale roared inside, slamming into him with icy teeth, scattering ash and sparks from the fire. And in the midst of that swirling void, framed in the doorway, loomed a shape so massive that for a heartbeat, Oren thought the storm itself had grown a body. It was a horse, black as midnight, a giant of muscle and bone, its hide drenched in snow and ice. Steam erupted from its nostrils in great plumes. Its eyes caught the firelight, burning like dim, defiant embers. This was no ordinary horse. This was a force of nature, a legend whispered about in taverns and around campfires. This was Behemoth, the phantom stallion of the northern plains, a creature no man had ever captured. Instinct screamed at Oren to slam the door. Every ounce of his hard-won survival instinct told him the same. A wild stallion this size could kill a man with a single blow. And then he looked down. Huddled against the stallion's powerful legs, shielded from the worst of the wind, were three smaller shapes, barely visible through the whipping snow. Foals. Their coats were thin, sodden, their tiny bodies shaking so violently it seemed they would tear themselves apart. One collapsed into the snow at the threshold, its legs folding as if the storm had finally sucked the last ounce of strength from it. A thin, pitiful whimper escaped its throat. That sound pierced Oren deeper than the cold ever could. It was not the cry of an animal. It was the cry of a dying child. The image of the empty cradle, still sitting in the dusty corner of his loft, flashed in his mind. The memory of the silence that had greeted him when he had returned 10 years ago. The silence of a life that never had a chance to begin. He saw his own failure, his own impotence against the storm, reflected in the glassy eyes of that dying foal. The stallion staggered a step forward into the doorway, its massive shoulders shaking, its eyes locked on Oren's. There was no aggression there, no fury, only a profound, silent plea. "Save my children." Oren's breath caught. His rifle rose as if by reflex, the barrel aimed directly at the stallion's broad chest, a final, desperate line of defense against the chaos of the world. He stood there for a single, eternal heartbeat, his finger taut on the trigger. Then, with a shuddering breath that felt like a sob, he lowered it. The decision crystallized, simple and impossible all at once. He stepped back. The gesture was small, but it was a clear invitation. He let the door swing wider against the storm and retreated a pace into the cabin. The great horse exhaled, a guttural sound of relief, and crossed the threshold. The ground trembled under its weight. One foal stumbled after it, collapsing onto the floorboards. The others followed, dragging themselves into the meager shelter. The door banged shut under the weight of the storm, sealing them all inside together. Oren stood by his dying fire, his rifle hanging limply in his hand, a stranger in his own tomb, which had suddenly, terrifyingly, come back to life. The cabin, always cramped, now seemed to shrink by half. Behemoth filled the room with his sheer presence, his shoulders brushing close to the rafters. The scent of wet hide, horse sweat, and the wild, clean smell of the storm saturated the air, overpowering the familiar scent of wood smoke. Oren felt like a trespasser. He spent the night half upright in his chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap, watching, waiting for the violence he was sure would come. But it never did. The storm passed by dawn. The world was a silent, unbroken sea of white. Oren's first thought was of his meager supplies. A handful of oats, some dried beans, a few strips of jerky. Enough for him to survive, not enough for them. He knew he had to go out, to check the traps he'd set along the ridge, to find whatever forage the storm hadn't buried. He dressed in silence, pulling on his heavy coat. When he reached for the door, Behemoth, who had been lying down, lifted his massive head, his eyes locked on Oren. A low, rumbling sound vibrated in his chest. It was not a threat. It was a question. "Will you come back?" "I'll be back," Oren whispered, the words a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "Just going for food." The world outside was alien and treacherous. Fences were buried, landmarks vanished. Every step was a struggle through the heavy, crusted snow. His lungs burned, but he pressed on, driven by a purpose he hadn't felt in a decade. He found a single snowshoe hair in one of his traps, a miracle. He gathered what little dry brush he could find poking through the snow. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he trudged back, the cabin came into view, a small, dark shape in the vast whiteness. He paused at the threshold, his heart pounding. He had left. Would he be allowed to return? He pushed the door open. The warmth of the cabin rolled out to meet him. Behemoth was on his feet, massive and terrible in the firelight, his eyes locked on Oren. The air was taut as a bowstring. Then, slowly, deliberately, the great horse lowered his head. It was not submission. It was permission, acknowledgement. Oren let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and closed the door behind him. The test was over. He had left, and he had been allowed to return. In the days that followed, a new, fragile rhythm was established. The cabin was no longer a place of silence. It was filled with the soft sounds of life. The rustle of straw as the foals slept, the quiet munching of hay, the deep, resonant breathing of the stallion. Oren tended to them with a methodical, almost obsessive care. He shared his food, doling out precious oats into his own cupped hand, feeling the soft, ticklish brush of the foals' muzzles against his skin. He spoke to them, not in full sentences, but in low murmurs. "Easy now. There's not much left. We'll make it stretch." He found himself smiling once, a small, unfamiliar crack in the frozen mask of his face, as he watched two of the foals clumsily nudge each other. The thought crept into him slowly, unwelcome yet undeniable. I didn't just save them. They are saving me. On the fifth day, another sound broke the silence. The thud of hooves, but this time, controlled, confident. A rider's cadence. Oren's hand went to his rifle. He eased the door open just enough to peer through the crack. A man sat on a fine horse, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat trimmed with wolf fur. His face was hard, his eyes pale and assessing. "Name's Corbin," the stranger said, his voice carrying low but clear. "I own the spread north of here. Folks say I've got a talent for breaking what can't be broke. And for hunting, the ones too wild to break." His eyes gleamed with a cold fire. "I've been tracking a legend, a black giant." Oren's blood ran cold. He tried to block the doorway with his body, but the fire in the hearth popped, and for a single, fatal moment, the silhouette of Behemoth, massive and unmistakable, was thrown against the far wall. Corbin's breath caught. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "Son of a Behemoth. The stories are true." His voice hardened, greed sharpening each word. "That hide alone would fetch a fortune. And those foals, do you know what they'd sell for?" His gaze flicked back to Oren, a predator's gleam in their depths. "You can't keep him. You've got nothing. But I can make you a rich man. Step aside." Oren set his boots firmly in the doorway, the rifle still hidden but ready. His voice was quiet, steady as steel. "He's not for sale." Corbin's smile turned vicious. "If you won't sell, then I'll take. That's how it works. The wild belongs to the man who can master it." His hand slid toward the revolver at his hip. Oren moved instantly. The butt of his rifle pressed firm against his shoulder, the barrel snapping upward until its dark mouth stared directly into Corbin's chest. "Get off my land," Oren said, his voice flat. Corbin laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "You and what army, old man? You think that beast will thank you? It'll crush you the moment its strength returns." He made a slight move, preparing to draw. In that instant, the unthinkable happened. From inside the cabin came a sound, a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Behemoth took a deliberate step forward, his massive head and shoulders appearing in the doorway directly behind Oren. He was not aggressive. He simply stood there, a wall of black muscle, his eyes fixed on Corbin with an intelligent, unwavering intensity. He had placed his body between the threat and the man who had sheltered him. Corbin froze. His hand hovered over his gun. He was a hunter, a master of breaking animals. He knew aggression. He knew fear. He did not know this. He was facing not one, but two opponents, one of whom was a legend that had just chosen a side. The standoff stretched for a long, silent minute. Corbin's bravado crumbled, replaced by a grudging, fearful respect. He spat into the snow. "You'll regret this," he muttered, but the threat was empty. He backed his horse away, turned, and rode off, swallowed by the vast, white emptiness. Oren didn't lower his rifle until Corbin was a distant speck on the horizon. He exhaled, the breath leaving him in a ragged, shuddering cloud. He had survived. They had survived. He closed the door and leaned against it, his legs suddenly weak. He looked at the horse. Behemoth stood in the center of the cabin, his gaze still fixed on Oren. The stallion lowered his head slowly, a deliberate, controlled gesture. It was not submission. It was a bow, a gesture of acknowledgement, of partnership. Oren felt something break open inside him, a dam of grief and loneliness that had held for 10 long years. "All right," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "All right then." He walked not to the rifle, but to the hearth. He fed the fire, coaxing a strong, steady flame from the embers. The cabin filled with a warm, golden light. The foals, awakened by the commotion, stirred in their straw bed. Oren smiled, a real smile that reached his tired eyes. The cabin was no longer a tomb. It was a shelter, a home. He looked at the stallion, who had not moved, who was simply watching him. The horse did not belong to him, could not, would not. But tonight, the stallion had chosen him, chosen to stay, chosen to stand with him. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the sleeping foals and the watchful giant, Oren felt a peace he had thought was lost to him forever. He was no longer the solitary groundskeeper of a grave. He was a guardian, a father. He was, at long last, a family man again. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after. But he knew he would not face it alone. The storm outside had ended, and the storm inside him, after 10 long years, had finally begun to quiet.